The spark, the cabin doors hissed shut as passengers settled into their seats, overhead bins clicked closed, and the faint scent of jet fuel still lingered in the air. Flight 482 from Atlanta to Amsterdam was fully booked, and inside row 1 for C sat a man who drew little attention despite being the kind of person who could take control of a collapsing world with just his voice. Jerome Banks wore a calm expression, one sculpted by years of mastering fear, danger, and secrets that would shatter most people's reality. His suit was pressed clean, a quiet gray jacket over a black t-shirt, no insignias, no military pins, nothing to hint at the kind of man he was, but the quiet power he radiated was almost tangible to those sensitive enough to feel it. Beside him, lying obediently, was Titan, a black German shepherd with bright amber eyes and the disciplined energy of a soldier in waiting, wearing a vest that clearly read "Service Dog." The canine lay silently, not making a sound, even as the occasional toddler waddled by curious or a cart rolled too close to his paws. Titan did not move. Jerome reached down, running his fingers across the top of his dog's head, a gesture as natural to him as breathing. The two of them were bonded, not just through training but through fire and smoke and missions that never made it into reports. Jerome had retired from active service 6 months ago, but his mind never stopped scanning rooms, exits, body language. Everything was a threat until proven otherwise. The reason for this trip was personal. He never wanted to be on a commercial flight again, but it was the only option. This time he was visiting a fallen brother's family to deliver something personal, something sacred. Continued to shuffle past and take their seats. A mother of 3 argued with her teenager near the back, while a businessman cursed about overhead space. Jerome tuned it all out. He always tuned it out, until the moment he couldn't, the moment someone crossed a line, and that line came faster than expected. Maria had been flying routes for 9 years, and today she was behind schedule. The flight had been delayed twice, and the passengers were already annoyed she hadn't had her coffee, and her feet ached. And as she moved through the aisle performing final checks, she noticed the large black dog in row 1 for C, occupying more space than usual. She paused, her brow furrowing. Service dogs annoyed her not because she hated animals, but because she'd seen too many passengers abuse the system, bringing pets on board and calling them emotional support animals. She'd grown jaded and over time stopped reading the vests or looking at certification. "Sir," she said with a sharpness in her tone, "your dog could not block the aisle." Jerome looked up calmly, his eyes steady, his posture unmoved. "He's not blocking the aisle, Mammy. I'm telling you he is," she snapped. "I need to get this cart through and he's in the way." Jerome looked down. Titan was as he always was, curled and tightly, body within the seat's perimeter. He wasn't in the way, not by any rational standard. I'll reposition him, but he's in the correct spot now, Jerome replied. Maria had no time, no patience, and no awareness of who she was speaking to. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, and without thinking she bent down and nudged Titan's side with her foot. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful, it was the kind of dismissive act a person gives to a stubborn piece of luggage. Titan let out a startled yelp. The sound pierced Jerome's ears. His mind flashed with memories of combat zones, of alarms, of smoke, and his dog taking bullets for him. On more than one occasion the sound triggered something visceral and primal, a switch flipping so fast even he had to remind himself to breathe before reacting. He stood slowly, towering over her, his voice low and thunderous. "Ma'am, step back from my service dog now." Maria blinked, startled by the change. The cabin around them grew quiet. Passengers turned heads. Some put down phones, others removed earbuds. "I'm just trying to do my job," she stammered. "You kicked my dog," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing and his tone sharp enough to carve ice. Maria stepped back involuntarily and tried to regain control. "But you don't understand. You're right. I don't understand how someone in your position thinks it's acceptable to touch any service animal, let alone kick one." Titan, now upright, had placed himself slightly in front of Jerome, his body tense but not aggressive. A man across the aisle spoke loudly. "You kicked his dog? Seriously, that's not what happened," Maria said, her voice cracking as she looked to the other flight attendant for help. But her partner had seen everything and stood frozen. Jerome opened his jacket slowly and retrieved his ID. The kind not many people ever see, and even fewer understand. He held it up, not to flash it around, but to make a statement. "Jerome Banks, Commander, United States Army, retired Delta Force, identification 00357, Ninan, OW." The temperature in the cabin dropped. Maria's face drained of color. A hush ran down the rows as some passengers began recording. "He's not just some guy," someone whispered. "He's Delta Force." Another said, barely audible. Maria's lips parted, but no words came. "Let me be perfectly clear, Jerome," said my dog. "Titan is not a pet. He is not a comfort animal. He is a trained war veteran, with 3 overseas deployments to life-saving medals and a record that includes saving 20 civilian lives under fire. He was at my side when I dragged a 14-year-old girl out of a collapsed hospital in Kandahar. He was with me when I stopped a bomb in Djibouti. He was beside me when my helicopter was shot down, and he pulled me through the jungle bleeding for hours until evac came. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air vents. You do not touch him, you do not question his presence, and you do not make the mistake of assuming that a man's quiet nature means you have permission to cross him. Jerome's voice was not loud, but it reached every corner of that aircraft. Maria stood frozen, her mouth dry, her eyes blinking fast as her hand fell to her side. "Sorry," she whispered. He replied not to me. To him. She looked at the dog, trembling slightly. I'm sorry." Titan did not blink. He stood still, disciplined, loyal. Another flight attendant arrived, summoned by the captain, who had been alerted through the computer. "Problem here, sir." "Yes," Jerome said clearly. "Your flight attendant assaulted my service dog." Captain looked from Jerome to Titan to Maria, who now seemed to realize just how far out of line she had spell. "I'll need a written statement, sir, once we land." "You'll have it," Jerome said calmly, and sat back down, hand resting gently on Titan's head. The dog relaxed slowly, but his eyes stayed alert. Passengers whispered. One leaned over to another and said, "I've seen that man's face before. He was on some military documentary or something." Another said quietly, "That woman just messed with the wrong guys." The plane taxied down the runway. The captain came over the speakers, welcoming everyone aboard, offering apologies for earlier delays. But no one was really listening. The mood had shifted completely. Jerome pulled a small notebook from his inner pocket and started writing a letter for a widow he was going to see across the ocean. But in the back of his mind something wasn't sitting right. Something about this flight, the way the crew had responded, the delay, the looks he'd gotten when he boarded, and in his bones, trained to detect things others never noticed. Jerome felt that something else was going to happen on this plane, something much worse than a kicked dog, and when it came, he knew he and Titan would be ready. The tension builds. Jerome leaned back into his seat, trying to focus on the letter in his hands, but the pen trembled slightly between his fingers, not out of fear, but instinct. Something inside him that had been shaped through years of danger whispered that things were not as they appeared, and Titan felt it too. The dog had settled down again, lying close, but his ears stayed perked and his body only half relaxed, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet come. Flight 482 climbed steadily toward cruising altitude, and passengers returned to their devices, books and snacks. But around Jerome, a quiet respect had taken shape. People gave him space. A few nodded subtly as they passed to the lavatory, the kind of nods given to someone whose story they didn't know, but whose strength they could feel. The flight attendant, Maria, stayed far away, replaced now by a younger man named Chris, who spoke softly and moved with nervous precision. "Commander, I just want to say, I saw what happened earlier," Chris said, kneeling beside Jerome's seat, his voice low and sincere. "I'm sorry for what she did." Jerome gave him a brief glance and nodded appreciation. "Noted it. There's anything you need, just let me know, sir." Jerome turned back to the letter, but again something gnawed at him. He had been on hundreds of flights in hostile skies and quiet, diplomatic corridors, and the same rule always applied. The quietest flights often held the loudest danger. There was something unnatural about the energy on this aircraft. The way some passengers kept glancing up, not at the crew but toward the emergency exits. The way to particular men near the back never really got comfortable. Instead, they kept whispering, switching seats twice during boarding, then once again after takeoff. Jerome had marked them already. He had seen the subtle hand signals pass between them, the quick checks of the seatbelt clasp, the shifting of their coats. Titan's head suddenly rose, and his body tensed. Jerome immediately looked up, following his dog's focus. The man in seat 29F was reaching into the overhead bin, not entirely strange, except the plane was in mid-flight, and the fasten seatbelt sign was still on. "Sir, please remain seated until the sign is off," Chris said, approaching quickly. The man froze, then slowly withdrew his hand. "Sorry, thought I dropped something." Jerome kept his eyes on the man's hands, watching for bulges, wires, anything off, but he saw none. The man's eyes, however, didn't match his tone. They were too alert to calculating, and they flicked quickly to another man near the galley before he sat back down. Jerome whispered Titan, and the dog stood slowly, eyes locked forward. "Sir, is everything all right?" the elderly woman beside him asked. Softly Jerome nodded slightly, but did not speak, and in that moment his mind shifted fully into the space he had trained for his entire life. He mapped the plane again in his head. 22 rows, first class, in front galley, midship and rear cockpit sealed at the front, only 3 flight attendants visible. He stood and made his way down the aisle, slowly pretending to stretch one leg. He walked past the 2 men near the rear, who immediately stopped talking. When he approached, he didn't look at them directly, but saw enough. Their arms remained stiff at their sides. Both had jackets on, and it wasn't cold. Returning to his seat, he took out a small black case from his carry-on and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of carbon paper and a pen with no ink, both harmless on their own, but together they formed a basic detection tool. He lightly dabbed the pen's head on the seat tray and slid it across the paper. A faint outline appeared. He had done this before, to see traces of explosives or chemical residue from items handled within the past few hours, and what appeared now was enough to stiffen his jaw. The faint streaks suggested nitrates. Not unusual for a security guard, or perhaps someone near fireworks, but highly unusual on a commercial flight. He reached down and tapped Titan twice. The dog responded by shifting forward, tail still and head low. Chris returned nervously with 2 drinks and whispered, "Again, Commander, there's a strange vibe from some of the guys near the back. I just heard them speaking in a language I couldn't place, and one kept checking his watch every couple of minutes. Tell the captain," Jerome said quietly, "to keep cockpit doors locked and alert ground control to stand by. You'd think this is something serious. I know when something's wrong," Jerome said. "You just make sure no one gets near the cockpit unless they're wearing stripes." Chris nodded and rushed forward, passing the information to the pilot room. Stood once more, this time with Titan beside him. Both moved toward the lavatories in the back, but it was just an excuse to get closer to the suspects. The 2 men noticed immediately, and one of them stood. "You got a problem, man?" the man asked, his voice forced, casual, but the edge was sharp. Jerome kept walking, didn't answer, and opened the rear lavatory door but didn't enter. Instead, he held it with one hand and watched through the reflection in the polished metal. The second man passed something under his jacket and tapped his shoe twice against the seat frame. A signal. Jerome stepped out and faced them now, directly. "Let me ask you a question," he said in a voice that cut through the cabin noise, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The 2 men froze. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Amsterdam." one replied, voice stiff. "What's the occasion?" "Vacation, to Gildenau. We met on the flight." Jerome stared at them, his eyes unblinking for several seconds. The first man shifted nervously. "Something funny about that?" Jerome didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Chris, who had followed him back. "Call the captain again." Now suddenly, the first man lunged, but not at Jerome, at Chris, trying to grab the comm device at his waist. Jerome moved like lightning, his elbow crashing into the man's arm, and Titan launched forward with a roar that froze half the plane. The second man tried to pull something from under his coat, but Jerome already had him by the wrist, twisting hard and forcing him into the galley wall. Passengers screamed, some ducked, others stood to record, and one began yelling, "Help, it's under control." Jerome barked, pushing both men face down onto the floor. Titan hovered near their backs, growling. Chris grabbed a set of zip ties from the service drawer, and together they restrained both men. Jerome reached into the first man's jacket and found what he feared, a homemade ignition switch. Incomplete but deadly enough, if connected to the right device. The pilot's voice came over the speaker, calmly requesting any trained law enforcement or military to make themselves known, but the situation was already under containment. As Jerome secured the weapons, he looked toward the forward cabin and saw Maria standing, pale mouth open, watching everything. She now understood exactly who Jerome was and what kind of man she had insulted earlier, and the shame in her eyes said more than any apology ever could. Titan returned to Jerome's side and sat, chest heaving but eyes still sharp. Chris looked at Jerome, his voice shaking. "You just saved this plane, sir." Jerome didn't respond right away. He was scanning again, always ready. "There, not alone," he finally said. "I felt it from the beginning." He looked at the subdued men, and then around the cabin at the passengers who now saw him not as a man with a dog, but as something else entirely, a force of nature in human form. This isn't over, and in that moment, as Flight 482 cruised high above the ocean, the real battle had just begun. The enemy within the cabin lights flickered for a second, too brief for most passengers to notice, but not for Jerome. His eyes snapped upward, scanning the overhead panels, then back toward the emergency exits. The aircraft hummed steadily at 37,000 feet, but something was off, something deeper than the subdued attackers now zip-tied in the rear galley, something colder. Heath crouched near one of them, searching their eyes for clues, but neither man would speak. They stared straight ahead, jaws clenched, and faces stone, still not defiant, not afraid, just eerily blank. Titan stood by the second man, his teeth bared, his muscles taut, every breath measured. Jerome touched the dog's neck, gently whispering, "Stay alert," and the command was understood without a sound. Chris had returned to his post, his eyes constantly shifting between the captain's door and the subdued attackers. He looked over and asked softly, "What happens now?" Jerome didn't answer right away. Instead, he examined the ignition switch more closely. The components weren't standard. Some wires looked old, some modern. The piece was modular, which meant it could connect to multiple types of devices. That meant one thing: someone else on this flight had the second part. He looked around, scanning every seat again, every face, every gesture. He saw a man with sunglasses still on, despite being indoors. A woman typing too quickly on her laptop, her eyes darting to the front and then downward to teenagers, pretending to sleep, but their breathing patterns didn't match real sleep, and none of them gave him the certainty he needed. The plane was too quiet, the tension too still. Jerome stood and walked back toward the cockpit, knocking once, then holding up his badge to the peephole. It slid open slightly, and the captain's eyes met his. "We have a situation," Jerome said plainly. "You already handled the two in the back." The captain whispered back, "They weren't alone." Jerome said this was a diversion. Captain's face tightened here, saying, "There's another one, at least one." Jerome said, "Maybe more. I need access to the passenger manifest and any irregular boarding notes." The door clicked open briefly, and a tablet was handed through. Jerome took it and walked back to his seat, scrolling the list as he sat. Titan pressed close again. There were names flagged by customs, but none that stood out until he found one: a standby passenger who had upgraded last minute, using cash payment, no luggage, no digital footprint. The name was generic Daniel Morris, and the seat listed was 1OB. Jerome glanced forward, toward row 10. The man sitting in B was older, balding, wearing a beige vest, and reading a magazine. He looked like anyone's uncle, someone who'd argue about the weather or forget where he parked his car. But there was something else. His fingers didn't move naturally. He turned each page with exact rhythm, and his eyes didn't follow the text. They stayed centered too perfectly. Jerome had seen this before, in deep cover agents maintaining cover while waiting for orders or a signal. Jerome rose slowly again, approaching as if on a casual walk toward the lavatory, but as he neared row 10, the man suddenly shifted. "Excuse me, sir," Jerome said. "May I see your boarding pass?" The man looked up, smiled politely, and said, "Sure," reaching into his pocket. But what he pulled out was not a boarding pass. It was a syringe. Jerome's reflexes snapped into motion. His arm shot forward, knocking the man's wrist sideways, and the syringe flew from his hand across the aisle. The man lunged for it, but Jerome tackled him mid-step, slamming his body into the seat edge. Titan charged behind, and passengers screamed. Chris and two other passengers ran forward to help pin the man as Jerome retrieved the syringe, holding it up for a better view. The needle tip was coated in a dark substance, thick and slow poison. Jerome muttered, then turned the man over and searched his vest, finding something even worse: a remote detonator. There it was, the other half of the device. Jerome spoke calmly into the intercom. Chris had brought back from the Gallagher. "Everyone calm, tell the captain he must not descend or make sudden moves. Someone rigged this plane." Passengers panicked, even though Chris tried to soothe them. Someone began crying, a child wailed, and a man started yelling, "This is why I hate flying." Jerome ignored them all. His focus was absolute. He took the device and walked quickly back to the subdued men at the rear. He held the remote before the first one and said, "Where is it?" No answer. He knelt eye to eye and asked again, "Where is the bomb?" The man's lips curled into a small smile. Titan stepped forward, letting out a low growl that grew louder each second. Still no answer. Then Jerome stood and addressed the entire cabin, his voice like thunder that silenced every noise. "Everyone, Stay in your seats, do not open bags, do not reach for overhead bins, do not move, unless I say so. If there is a device on this plane, and you trigger it by accident, we all go down. People froze, women clutched their children, men clenched armrests. One elderly passenger began to pray. Softly Jerome turned to Chris again. Need a mirror, a metal tray, something. Reflective Chris returned moments later with a metal tray from the food service cart. Jerome placed it under several seats near the midsection, looking for signs of heat distortion or electronic pulses, and there it was under row 17A behind the seat. Panel carefully tucked behind the insulation, a small grey device with blinking blue light. Jerome exhaled slowly. Kneeling with precision and care, he reached under and disarmed the casing, exposing the wires. Red, yellow, black eye, need wire cutters, he said. Chris opened the emergency kit and handed him a compact tool. Jerome whispered to himself, red, yellow, black, just like the desert, just like that day outside Basra. And then he remembered he had seen this setup before, the same wiring, the same construction. It wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. This was personal. A bomb's design matched one used by a former enemy, a ghost from the past, someone they thought was dead. Jerome cut the yellow wire first, then the red, then the black. The blinking stopped. Titan's ears perked forward, eyes locked on the now silent device. It's clear, Jerome said. Passengers exhaled, the tension finally breaking like a wave. Across the cabin, people wept. Some applauded, others simply stared at him. Chris looked pale, but smiled in awe. How did you know how to do that? Jerome didn't answer. He stood walking back toward the subdued a turtle. Me who sent you silence again. But the man's eyes shifted just slightly toward the front. Jerome understood. He turned and looked at the first-class cabin, and his stomach sank. There in seat 2A sat a woman dressed in elegant white, with a red scarf and a silver watch. She looked composed, unbothered, sipping wine like nothing had happened. Jerome recognized her. She was supposed to be dead 7 years ago. She was listed among the casualties in a raid across the border, a high-ranking operative from a covert group trained to destabilize infrastructure through biological and digital sabotage. Her codename was Selene, and now she was on this flight. Jerome knew what came next. She wasn't here to blow up the plane. That wasn't her style. She came to watch, to test his reactions, to provoke him, and maybe activate the sleeper cell. She looked up finally, and their eyes met. She smiled. The ghost from the past. Jerome stood frozen in the aisle, not because of fear, but because of the sudden clarity that struck him with the force of a bullet. Selene, the woman he had once hunted across 3 continents, the operative whose death report he had personally read, sat calmly sipping white wine, as though she were on a luxury train, not a hijacked aircraft. Her scarf was folded neatly, her watch gleamed silver, and her eyes had the same cold mischief they always carried. She tilted her glass slightly in a mocking toast to him, then lowered it, and smiled. Titan growled low, sensing the sudden shift in his master's body language. His eyes locked onto the woman in 2A. As Jerome began moving forward with quiet precision, not rushing, not reacting, just advancing with the steady footwork of a man who had lived too long in battle to be surprised by anything anymore. Passengers turned and stared, some recognizing that something far more dangerous than the earlier attackers had just emerged. Chris stood near the cockpit, visibly him in. Cockpit, what is it? What's wrong? Jerome didn't stop walking. He kept his eyes on Selene and said to Chris, keep everyone away from first class. Lock the galley door if you have to. This is beyond what you've seen. But who is she? Chris whispered. The woman who nearly collapsed half a continent with a virus that didn't exist on any medical register. The woman who slipped past 5 agencies like smoke and made sure every loose end bled. She died years ago, but now she's back, and she's smiling at me. Chris looked toward 2A, where Selene now set down her wine and folded her hands gently across her lap. Jerome stopped just 3 steps from her, their eyes locked, and in that moment the noise of the plane, the crying child, the hum of engines all disappeared. Saw your body on a slab, Jerome said flatly. Then you should know. I always preferred warmer places, she replied, her voice smooth and unbothered. Staged your own death. I adapted. You should try it sometime. Why this flight? Why now? Jerome asked. Because you are on it, she answered without hesitation. That's not reason enough, as if you're the only one who ever came close to breaking. Jerome leaned in slightly and whispered, you killed innocent people, you buried families, you turned children into bait, and yet here we are, both alive, both unfinished, she said, her smile never fading. He stood straight again, his mind calculating possibilities. If she was here and the 3 others had been caught, then she was either the backup plan or the real plan. She didn't need weapons, she was the weapon. Where's the second detonator? Jerome asked. Selene chuckled softly, still leaning back comfortably. I didn't bring a bomb this time, Jerome. I brought truth. What truth? That you are still a soldier, even when the war ended. That you need this chaos. That the plane without a threat is emptier than the battlefield. You think this is a game? No, she said. This is therapy. Jerome exhaled slowly, then said, either you're here to finish something, or you're here to start something. Which is it? Selene reached into her coat, and he stepped forward instantly, his hand on his hidden blade, but she simply pulled out a folded envelope, sealed in black wax. This isn't for you, it's for the captain, but you'll want to read it first, she said, handing it to him. Jerome took the envelope cautiously, opened it, and read. Inside were coordinates handwritten in an old cipher only high-ranking Delta Force used years ago, and a message that chilled him. What you buried in Sudan wasn't dead. It's waiting for you. Bring the dog or don't, but come along. Jerome looked up, eyes narrowed. You came all this way to give me an invitation. You wouldn't return my calls. You sent drones, not calls. I had to get your attention somehow. He stared at her, unsure what part of this was trap, what part was real, but the fact that she had this cipher meant someone had betrayed Delta. Someone still active. You had helped. She shrugged. Everyone does, even ghosts. You not walking off this plane, he said. She smiled again. Him not here to walk off. I'm here to be taken. Are you playing? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he and Titan could hear. If I disappear again, your entire command will be blamed for what happens next. But if you bring me in yourself, you'll learn the truth about who really signed those orders in Sudan. You think the operation ended because you closed that door, but you never asked who built the building. Jerome stared at her, heart pounding, not with panic, but with the collision of memories, truths, and the kind of betrayal that rewrites entire careers. Selene leaned back again, her lips forming the words, I win. Jerome turned and signaled Chris to approach. Get the emergency restraint she's been taken into. Kustadikri stared in disbelief. Her, but she it. Jerome snapped. Titan growled again, never turning his back on her, even as she calmly allowed the cuffs to be placed over her wrists. As Chris led her down the aisle, murmurs rose from the passengers, but no one moved to close her presence commanded both curiosity and dread. Jerome followed behind, watching every step, every breath of hers, calculating every risk, but knowing that the real danger wasn't the bomb in the belly of the plane, it was the truth she had just dropped into his hands. He stopped near the subdued attackers and asked one final time, who are you really working for? First man looked at Selene, and then back at Jerome, and said nothing. Jerome leaned down and whispered, if she's using you, then you'll be the one buried under her. When it's over, she doesn't share power, she consumes it. The man blinked but didn't speak. Titan moved closer, his presence alone forcing discomfort in the prisoners back in the cockpit. The captain received a silent nod from Jerome, signaling the situation had been stabilized. Chris stood by, visibly shaken. She's in holding. But what happens now? So now, Jerome said, we land, then I take her where she wants, and we see how deep this betrayal goes. Sir, with respect, why would you go where she wants? Because she just gave me the kind of bait that only the guilty offer when they think you've forgotten how to hunt us. The plane descended. Jerome stared out the window, not at the clouds but at the shadows forming below. He thought of Sudan, of the children he had failed, of the reports he was never allowed to read, and now he knew. Selene had not only returned from the dead, but she brought the truth with her. Titan nudged his leg, and Jerome whispered, not yet, but soon we'll run again. The trap. In the sand, the wheels screeched against the runway as Flight 482 touched down, the plane rolling to a steady stop at a secure hangar arranged in coordination with military command. The passengers were held on board for an hour, while agents in black suits swept the plane, interrogated the subdued attackers, and took custody of the hidden device. The passengers had no idea how close they had come to death, only that the quiet man with the dog and the cold woman in first class had somehow been at the center of it. Jerome exited last, Titan at his side, eyes scanning every corner of the tarmac as they moved past the line of black SUVs that waited outside. Selene followed, escorted by 2 agents, but she walked as if she still controlled the outcome. Her steps were light, her posture calm, her wrists still cuffed in front of her, but her face unreadable. Chris stood near the exit, watching them both, and asked quietly, what happens now? Sir. Jerome didn't answer. He walked directly to the vehicle waiting for him, and opened the door, holding it for Celine, without a word, she stepped in, and he followed, closing it behind them. The driver gave him a nod and took off, heading toward the remote airbase, where a private jet fueled and waiting would carry them to the coordinates Celine had provided down. Past the jet, silent, except for the low hum of engines and the rhythmic breath of Titan, who lay by the door, alert but calm. Jerome stared across at Celine, his arms crossed, his expression like stone. "Tell me where we're going again." "A place neither of us was meant to survive," she said. "A place you sealed off because someone told you the mission was complete." Sudundeepa. That entire village was wiped out. "Celine, I saw it with my own eyes." "You saw what they showed you. Who is they?" She leaned in slightly. "The agency within the agency, the ones who funded operations they didn't want traced, the ones who used people like you to eliminate the very evidence of their crime." Siawa, saying my command was compromised him, saying your command never had. Command. Jerome looked away briefly, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words collided with old memories and unanswered questions. "You saw the kids," she said. "You saw their hands bound before the strike. You saw the scars on their necks. I thought they were prisoners, they were experiments," she said softly. "And you burned the lab thinking you were saving them." Jerome closed his eyes. The flames came back, the screams, the charred rubble, the report he filed, marked confidential and buried. Who was behind it? She looked out the window and whispered, "Your mentor." Jerome snapped his head back toward her. "That's a lie. He's the one who wrote your deployment orders. He's the one who debriefed you, and he's the one who made sure none of your team survived to tell a different version. My team died in a cave enduring extraction did." Desalini handed him a photograph, aged and wrinkled, a shot taken from a high angle, showing two figures dragging bodies from a burning site. One of them wore the same vest as Jerome's sergeant. "This was taken 3 days after you left," she said. Jerome. His hands shook as he stared at the image, his breath growing heavier each second. Why would he do this? Because he was building something buried and ugly, and they used you to close the lid. The jet landed in a stretch of desert, marked by nothing but sand, wind and heat waves. The coordinates pointed to a rocky ridge beyond the hills, where satellite coverage had long been mysteriously disembarked. First, scanning the terrain, then motioned for Celine to follow. Titan stepped out, nose to the wind, body low, as if the ground itself warned him to stay back. They walked for an hour across the sand, no words exchanged, just the crunch of boots, the steady growl of wind, and the weight of truth pressing on their backs. Finally they reached the ridge, and Celine pointed to a metal hatch barely visible beneath a thin layer of rock. Jerome crouched, wiped it clean, and opened it. The smell of old chemicals rose up. Along with a wave of heat inside was a ladder descending into darkness. "After you," he said. Celine climbed down without hesitation, and he followed, pulling the hatch closed above them, plunging them into shadows only broken by the beam of his flashlight. The underground chamber was larger than he expected. Metal walls lined with rusted pipes, broken screens and dried blood-stained floors. At the center stood a glass chamber, cracked but still upright, filled with surgical instruments and the decaying remains of restraints. "This is where they tested them," she said. "The children, the locals, the enemies they said were terrorists. They injected them with things they didn't understand, and when the results failed, they burned the place down with the bodies inside." Jerome stood silent, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "You were the last signature on the report," she said. "You were the final piece, the man who made it official. I didn't know, but now you do." He walked deeper into the chamber, past crates marked in faded ink, some with US seals, others with no markings at all, and found a wall of photos pinned with names, ages and test numbers. They were all children. He backed away, his breath growing faster, his chest tightening. Titan went beside him, sensing his master unravel. Celine stepped closer and said, "This is why I brought you back, not to punish you, but to show you what they made us into, what they forced us to become. You became a monster by choice. I survived by knowing the truth." Jerome turned to her then and said, "So what now?" "Expose it. Already did." What? She handed him a flash drive, small and silver. "This has everything: files, locations, names, audio from inside the chain of command, your mentor's voice ordering the strike, calling it a cleanup." He stared at it, not taking Ithiel. "Kill me for this," he said. "They already tried," she said, nodding back toward the memory of Flight 482, the hijack, the setup, the planted devices. "It wasn't about the plane, it was about you." He finally took the drive and slid it into his vest pocket. "This ends now." "No," she said, "this begins now." Jerome stared at the cracked chamber one last time, then turned back to the ladder, climbing slowly into the dying sun. Above, Selene followed, her cuffs gone, her hands empty, her mission complete. The wind howled through the ridge, but Jerome heard something else beneath. It not footsteps, not threats, but the whispers of the past, demanding justice. Titan barked, once sharp and loud the signal. Clear they weren't alone. Black SUVs emerged on the horizon, dust clouds rising behind them. Fast and aggressive. You led them here, he said. I warned them if they followed, we'd all burn. Jerome drew his weapon slowly. Then let's show them how ghosts fight back. The final reckoning. The sand trembled as black SUVs roared toward the ridge, their engines cutting through the silence like approaching thunder. Jerome stood tall on the rocky ledge, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Titan beside him, unwavering eyes locked on the horizon. Selene remained behind him, arms folded, watching with an expression that was neither fear nor victory, but something deeper, a knowing that whatever happened next would not be forgotten. Jerome's breath slowed, his mind sharpened, every lesson, every scar, every command drilled into his bones for years now converged into this moment. The betrayal, the buried children, the flight, the trap, and now the reckoning that had waited far too long. He raised his arm, signaling Titan to stay, then stepped forward into the open sunlight. As the first SUV skidded to a halt, throwing sand into the air, the doors flew open, and men in black tactical gear stepped out, rifles raised, but their stances uncertain. Had not expected him standing there, unshaken, unafraid. From the second vehicle stepped a man, older, silver-haired, with eyes that once looked upon Jerome with pride, but now only held calculation. His name was Commander Rick Mason, Jerome's former mentor, the architect of 100 missions, and the man Jerome once trusted with his life. Messenger, Rome, this is how you repay the ones who served you. This is how I protect the country, by killing children, by silencing your own men, by turning your soldiers into grave diggers and your labs into butcher shops. You were never supposed to see it, but I did, and now I know. Maswal signaled the men behind him to hold their fire and stepped closer, his hands visible but not raised. You don't understand the kind of threats we face. No, Jerome said, I understand too well, and I no longer serve them. You think this ends with me? Mason said, it ends with truth. Jerome pulled the flash drive from his vest and held it high. This contains every file, every voice, every lie. And when it is released, your empire falls, your name vanishes from the walls of command, and the dead will finally speak. Mason's expression cracked for the first time. Something in his eyes shifted from control to feral. Be hunted, you'll be erased, then so be it, but not before the world knows who buried the innocent. In silence and flame behind him, Selene behind him. Selene stepped into the open, now holding nothing, not even her past, just her presence, a witness to both the horror and the raised his hand again, but Jerome moved first, his voice cut through the wind. If a single bullet leaves that rifle, none of you leave this ridge alive. Titan growled, stepping forward, fangs bared the warning. Clear. The agents hesitated, unsure, eyes darting between the man they served and the warrior who stood before them. No backup, no shield, just truth and fury. Then slowly one agent lowered his rifle, then another, then all, until only Mason stood alone. You made me believe, Jerome said, you made me kill for you, and you made me forget what honor meant, but I remember now, and I will not let it end in shadow. Mason stepped back, his voice cold. You won't live long enough to press send. Jerome smiled, not the smile of revenge, but of freedom. I already did. Mason's face drained of color as the sound of a chopper echoed in the distance. News drones, satellite feeds, emergency transmissions, spreading the contents of the drive across every secure and public network. From hidden agencies to foreign watchdogs, every line, every order, every secret now unsealed. Whilst over, Jerome turned without a word, walked back toward Selene and Titan, who followed without question. They left the ridge together, not as enemies, not as allies, but as survivors of a war most people would never know had been fought. By nightfall, every screen in every command room would show the truth, and no name would be safe, not even the ones carved into medals. Jerome never looked back, and the desert buried its silence once more. The end.